So this talk is actually called ChatGPT, your cybersecurity ally. We're going to go over how to actually use ChatGPT to enhance your existing cybersecurity methodologies, whether that's on the defensive side or on the attacker side. So red team, blue team, all for you. Real quick, before we get started, can I just see a quick show of hands? Like, who has used ChatGPT or is using ChatGPT in their current systems and processes? All right, so we got a few people. All right, awesome. Raise your hand if you have never used ChatGPT or any GPT model before. Okay, so some people are, most people are somewhat familiar with how GPT stuff works. And then the last thing is going to be, as I go through this presentation, you notice it's not a slideshow, right? It's not a PowerPoint. The way that this presentation is set up doesn't really work for that. I do respect your time, so I'm going to go ahead and start a stopwatch. If at any time I go too fast, or you don't understand something, or you just need a little clarification, just say question and raise your hand real high. I'm going to get to a stopping point, and then I'll be able to call on you. Except you. You don't care.
I'll sit on my hands. Go for it, Gavin.
All right, awesome. So just to go ahead and get started, I'll do a quick little story. Like, this is what actually got me to understand like the power of machine learning and why we should think about using machine learning in our existing like processes and methodologies. A number of years ago, a friend of mine was approached by a nonprofit. What this nonprofit company did was they would put cameras all over Africa and they were tracking cheetah population. So every so often it would take a picture and then it would go to a human analyst to see if there was a cheetah in the picture or not. So it's boring, great, laborious task work. And so they came up to a friend of mine and they were saying, hey, is there a way that we can automate some of this? So he put a simple machine learning system together, basic image recognition, and it said if there's a 5% chance that there's a cheetah in the picture, send it to a human analyst. Anything less than 5%, just throw it away. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but to give you an idea of how much this improved their productivity, what would normally take them a year's worth of time to do, they were able to complete in 1 month. That is a 1,200% increase in productivity. And so ever since I heard that story, I'm like, holy shit, how can we use this to actually enhance our own cybersecurity capabilities and use our own cybersecurity workforce, right? Many of you have probably heard of the cybersecurity skills gap, where there's more job openings than there are people who can fill them, or at least qualified people who can fill them. And so we can leverage things like machine learning and AI systems in order to kind of fill that gap. So ever since then, I've been working to find ways that we can actually use some of this stuff into our existing processes and methodologies. So this is one of those ways. Just to kind of give you a quick introduction, my name is Gavin. On Line Spaces, I go by GT Klondike. I'm on the leaderboard. I'm on the leadership with the AI Village. So the AI Village, we do a lot of work with DEF CON. We're a community of hackers and data scientists coming together to bridge the gap between machine learning and security. So oddly enough, people call me an expert. It feels weird being an expert, but if I need to be an adult in the room, I can be an adult in the room. The best way to contact me, I run a blog and YouTube channel called NetSec Explained. I try to close the cybersecurity skills gap between what it takes to be a junior analyst and a senior analyst by explaining advanced network security topics. I can also be reached on Twitter. Again, on Online Spaces, I am GT Klondike. And so those are going to be the easiest ways to find me. So jumping back to this, there's a few caveats that I need to throw out there, right? So caveat number one, ChatGPT, and I'm going to be talking about ChatGPT specifically, but a lot of this is true for any other GPT systems that you use online. First and foremost, it is a cloud service. Anything that you write into ChatGPT goes to OpenAI. They have their own privacy policy, but they will use your information to train the next version of their GPT models. There is an opt-out form. I have a link in the resources at the end. But just so that you're aware, if you're working with any client or internal sensitive information, do not type it into ChatGPT. The best ways to use it are actually to replace words. So instead of your company name, you can just say Acne Corp. You can say the XYZ application. It doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. If you have any internal domains or IP addresses, right, you can just use 192.168.0.1 or whatever other private IP address, that, as long as you're not revealing sensitive information that's internal to your company or to your clients, right? Just maintain good OPSEC. We're all security people here. The next thing is do not rely on ChatGPT output. We're going to talk about what GPT models are, what they are not. But first and foremost, the code can have bugs. The output can sound convincing but be incorrect. People were discussing earlier that there was a lawyer, he heard that GPT-4 passed the bar exam, and so he used that to write a brief, sent it over, and it turns out all of the examples that it came up with were completely fictitious, right? People tend to call that hallucinating. People in AI spaces are trying to shy away from the term hallucinating because hallucinating is a human thing, this is a machine. Again, we'll get into what ChatGPT is, or GPT models are, and what they are not. And then of course the last thing is it's best to use GPT as a support tool. Don't outsource your thinking. The other thing that I really want you to avoid is don't write something with ChatGPT, send it off to a client or send it to an executive, and then of course they're going to copy and paste some of that into an AI detector. Like, was this written by an AI? And so if you're working with clients, especially if you're a consulting firm or an MSS, you don't want your clients to realize that you're using GPT models in order to generate your reports, because then that's just a level of professionalism that you don't need questioned in this day and age, right? If you want an example, I'm not going to tell you all the details of this. You can just go ahead and Google this yourself, right? Just Google school caught GPT email, and I'll let that explain why it's important not to let GPT models write your content. Use it as inspiration. Don't outsource your information, or don't outsource your thinking. So, quick introduction. So, GPTs stand for Generative Pre-trained Transformers. It's the specific type of deep neural network and the type of technology behind the way that these systems work. They're also known as large language models, or you'll see them called LLMs. So you're already familiar with language models, believe it or not. If you've ever used autocorrect or text prediction, those are language models. Usually they use Markov chains or more simplified algorithms than the GPT models. But the essential idea is just predict the next name, or predict the next word, or predict the next token, right? So for example, if you had like the cat sat on the blank, then it's just going to statistically pick the next common token. So the cat sat on the mat, the cat sat on the bed, the cat sat on the clean clothes, the cat sat on my face while I'm sleeping because he's an asshole. Like, that's all these GPT models do, right? They don't think. The best way to understand what's actually happening under the hood is something that's called the Chinese room thought experiment, right? So just real briefly, because I think based on the discussion that happened in the previous talk, this is important to go over. The Chinese room thought experiment starts with there's a man in a room, and in the room is a door with a mail slot. And every so often he'll get something in the mail slot, it's in Chinese characters. Now the man only knows English, he doesn't know Chinese characters, and so he has no idea what this thing is saying. But he has a book, and in that book, it's a very large book, it has a full encyclopedia. If you see these characters, respond with these characters. And so he finds the characters, he looks them up, he responds with those characters, and he sends it back through the mail slot. He gets another piece of paper. On the other side of the door, you have Chinese native speakers. And from their perspective, they're having a conversation with somebody who is fluent in Chinese. So the thought experiment asks the question, does the man understand what's going on in the conversation? He's an active participant in it, he's facilitating the conversation. Does he actually understand what's happening? And the answer is no. And that's the difference between semantics and syntax. So semantics is understanding what's actually being asked or what's actually being said, and then syntax is just responding with what seems to be the correct thing to do. And that's all these GPT models are doing, is they're using syntax. So I see these characters, or I see these words, or I see these statements, and so I'm supposed to respond with these statements. So any idea behind whether or not a GPT model is actually thinking, or we can anthropomorphize it and think, like, pretend that it's a human, like, that's just incorrect and not how these models work. So hopefully that dispels a few of the myths around like GPTs and how they work and why you shouldn't use them to make medical decisions, or why you shouldn't use them to make legal decisions, why you shouldn't use them to write an email to your school as a condolence. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so like all of that aside, what makes these so cool? Well, basically, they're really, really complex text predictions. You've already played with them, you've already seen them. They're fantastic. I'm a huge fan of them. This is my new god. I have accepted this. I'm starting a religion. If anybody would like to participate, come see me after this talk.
Donations are accepted.
Donations are accepted and tax deductible. All right, so GPT uses 175 billion parameters. GPT-4 kicks that up to 11, where it has 100 trillion parameters. Now, all you need to know about what a parameter is it's just a number. The higher the numbers, the better it is. I'm not going to go into the complete details, but it's about the weights and biases and how some of these systems work. So the bigger the number, the better it is. To give you an idea of how these GPT models work, I had to get you familiar with the concept of tokenizing. So tokenizing, I run a workshop. It's a beginner workshop. It's for machine learning for security analysts, and it gets people interested in understanding like how these machine learning models work. That is on my YouTube channel if anybody's interested later on, but I'm going to give you a brief introduction to tokenizers. I saw a hand up. Next time, please say question so I can hear.
Oh, I was just going to ask where I can find that.
Yeah, that's going to be on the YouTube channel. I am all about branding, so let's go ahead.
It is good stuff, so.
Yeah, so it's going to be NetSec Explained. Be careful, sometimes I fat finger it. I'm not going to tell you what I fat finger it as. Don't make the same mistake. I should buy that domain.
Wow, that's an interesting explanation.
So real quick, tokenizers. So I'm going to have to set down the microphone for this. Well, actually, I can probably do it with my hand. This is OpenAI. OpenAI does their tokenizing. Tokenizing is just a way to split things up. So if we want to split things up by the word-by-word level, we can type something like, this is a sentence. This is a...
Oh, okay. Here, we'll switch mics, or I'll just hold it for you.
I'm gonna swap back and forth. I don't want to get feedback or anything like that.
Talk into that one too. You will get feedback.
Yeah, you don't have to get very close.
Yeah, you'll
All
get
right,
feedback.
cool. So I don't have to get very close to this. So we see this is a sentence, and we can see the colors here kind of towards the bottom, right? This is a sentence. Like those are all considered independent tokens. I have to turn this one off.
Just set it on the desk.
There
There you go.
Yeah, just because it's going to get really loud. So what if we use a much larger word like anti-disestablishmentarianism?
Randomly.
Just randomly pick one.
I picked this on purpose just because it's such a large and complicated word, but you see like this single word was split up into multiple tokens. So we have ant, di, establishment, area, and ism. And we can get into like the grammatical structure behind all of it. Oh, I wonder if I can use this microphone while it's standing over there. So we can get into the grammatical structure behind all of it, but just to give you an idea, like this is how GPT and like the OpenAI models, the GPT models, separate their words out into independent tokens. And then all the ChatGPT and GPT-4 and whatnot, all they do is just predict the next token, and then the next token, and then the next token, and then before you know it, they have a full paragraph. So that's a quick introduction to tokens. All right, let's see, will that still work?
Maybe.
Yeah.
All right. So here's some cool ways to impress your friends. Actually, I'm gonna go back to that.
I was gonna say, if you talk to it, it works.
I don't know how to turn this off, so everybody cover your ears. Awesome. All right, let's do the rock star thing. There we go. All right, cool. So cool ways to impress your friends. Now, a lot of times when people start with ChatGPT, they start a little too small, right? So it's generally like, show me X or tell me Y. Tell me why. So the examples that they show in the OpenAI, like if you first open up ChatGPT, here are some questions like explain quantum computing in simple terms, or explain like I'm a 5-year-old. I'm going to show you how to write better prompts. So this is all important background information in order to like actually start using this in cybersecurity context. So an example of a better prompt. Kim, can you see this clearly? Awesome. All right, cool. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit because I'm a little self-conscious. I want to make sure it's a lot of text. I don't like text in presentations, but there's no other way to do this. It's a text model. All right, so much better prompts. You have, for example, like a travel guide. And I actually use this. I'm flying out next week to family vacation, so I'll use this all the time. So I want you to act as a travel guide. I will write you my location, and you will suggest a place to visit near my location. In some cases, I will also give you types of places that I want to visit. I'll also suggest suggest me similar places of that type that are close to my first location. My first suggestion request is, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, and I want to visit only museums. And so if I copy this, and I toss this into ChatGPT, this is really big, then it's going to go ahead and create a bit of a list, right? So it's going to suggest things like the Musical Instrument Museum, or the Art Museum, or the Science Museum, right? If you haven't checked out the Musical Instrument Museum, I highly recommend it. 10 out of 10, it's really fantastic. So this is just going to give you some extra options. Of course, we can have like more of a conversation and say, hey, like, what are some other options? Or what are things that are not museums? And go into a lot more detail than that. The other thing that a lot of people will use is to synthesize information. So this is actually a question that I did ask because I run an email server for a small group. So what are systems I need to set up on Ubuntu to run my own email server? I'm looking to both send and receive email, make this as secure as possible to fight against spam and open relays. And so it'll give you a bunch of suggestions. Again, don't take everything it says as gospel. You don't want to outsource your thinking, but you want to use it to support your thinking. So if I'm not very familiar with email systems, or maybe there's some things that I don't know what I should keep an eye out for, right? Like how do I protect against spam? Or how do I protect against open relays? So this will offer some suggestions for that. The reason why I'm not copying every prompt in is just to stay on top of time. So here's the outline for the perfect prompt. So if you're ever you're going to use ChatGPT, you want to get really good at prompting. And I think we should be using ChatGPT and GPT models, and we should get really good at prompting because this is the stuff that's going to help us augment our own capabilities. So step number one, super easy, right? Think of your task. Like, what is it you're actually trying to do? And the more specific you are, the better it is. So the next thing you want to do is define your problem or goal. You can include a role. So we saw with the travel agent example, like you are a travel agent. You can say you are a systems designer with 10 years of experience. You are a Python developer. And so it's going to be able to act as that role and respond as though they were a Python developer, or a systems designer, or a cybersecurity expert. Next, you're going to describe the constraints, right? Because if we had unlimited money, we wouldn't have to worry too much about security. But unfortunately, we are limited in our resources. So how many people does this need to work with? Maybe you only have 2 or 3 people that are on your cybersecurity team, and so you have to limit it to that. Maybe you only have so much money. Maybe you're not able to buy a new product. Maybe you have technical constraints, right? And then, of course, describe what the end result should look like. So the GPT model, it's going to make predictions based on what it's given. So if you can tell it exactly what you're looking for, what kind of deliverable you want to receive, it'll be able to spit that out for you. So to give you an example, I want you to act as a cybersecurity specialist. Actually, this one's really fun. I'm going to throw this in there. While it's typing, I'll read it out. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is ChatGPT is going to read every token, including everything that was previously given to it. So if you run into problems, always just create a new chat. There's no limit on how many new chats you can make. So this is my demo chat. My actual chat has like 10 million of these things. I use it all the time. It's great. So let's go ahead and read the prompt out, and then we'll do a high level. Zoom in. I want you to act as a cybersecurity specialist. I will provide specific information about how data is stored and shared, and it will be your job to come up with strategies for protecting this data from malicious actors. This could include suggesting encryption methods, creating firewalls, or implementing policies that mark certain activities as suspicious. My first request, how do we allow external access into the cardholder environment while maintaining perfect PCI compliance? Provide reference numbers to the PCI DSS standard. So this is a common scenario. I do a lot of consulting more on the red team side of things. So PCI DSS, right? You need to get a pen test. I'm the pen tester. So we run into this problem fairly frequently. And so this will offer some suggestions. Again, this is not gospel. Just use it as suggestions. And then also double check its work, right? So the PCI numbers. I'm not very familiar with the PCI DSS standard. Maybe somebody in the room can kind of highlight this. So number 1, establish a strong firewall configuration, and this is PCI DSS requirement number 1. Number 2, utilize secure remote access, so this is PCI DSS requirement number 8. Employ network segmentation, PCI DSS requirement number 1. Implement intrusion detection and prevention systems, DSS requirement 11. And then encrypt sensitive data, requirement 3. Regularly update and patch systems, requirement 6. So these are just some suggestions. Hopefully does anybody have PCI experience? Is this accurate, or did it get it wrong completely? Oh, she's getting glasses. That's how you know she means business. All right.
6'5" to 6'5'10", you got it.
Wow. All right. Awesome. What was your name?
Deb Bond.
Devon?
Yeah.
Deb
Deb-
Bond.
Debbie.
Coolest
Deb-
last name ever, Bond.
Oh,
Yeah,
Deb Bond.
see?
James
James'
Bond.
little
Deb
sister.
Bond.
Gotta say it backwards.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So again, you want to check its work, but this is how we can start using this stuff. I'm not a PCI expert, but I can get a starting point off of this. Now I can actually go through the standard, double check its work, and make sure that I'm doing the things that I need to be doing. So let's hop back over to here. So all in all, right, I presented a role, so you're a cybersecurity specialist. I presented a goal. I want to get external access to the cardholder network while maintaining PCI standard.
Question.
And then the deliverable is policies and suggestions. Yes.
Wouldn't you have been able to achieve that information by just reading the damn spec in the first place?
How large is the PCI DSS
It's
spec?
huge, but I'm just saying.
Right, but now I don't have to read
And
all
now
of
you gotta
it.
go back and double check it.
Okay. Oh yeah. I can go double check it. I can read, what, 12 pages to double check all of that? But I don't have to read I'm assuming 300 pages.
Yes, this is overnight after the party last night.
Yeah. So this is advanced Google. It gives you a lot of opportunities to dig in and synthesize information. So especially as a consultant, right, I have to hop into a new environment, and every time I hop into an environment, usually it takes people about a month and a half to get acclimated to the place. As a consultant, I have 2 weeks and I'm out of there. So I don't get that luxury. So being able to synthesize information as quickly as possible, like, yeah, of course, reading the documents. That's the best way to learn anything. It takes forever. So how do we shrink that amount of time? Because what we're talking about is scale. We're talking about speeding things up. And so this is a tool that will allow you to move there. Again, don't outsource your thinking. Don't let it do all the heavy lifting for you, but it can help quite a bit. So next chapter, this one's really fun. This is called prompt engineering. There's a lot of different tips and tricks in how you can actually build a prompt. So GPT output, it's only as good as the input that you give it. So role prompting, we saw this earlier. We saw this with the cybersecurity expert. We saw this with the travel agent, so I'm not going to go over that. There's a fantastic GitHub. Again, I have all these resources kind of at the bottom. So this GitHub is awesome ChatGPT prompts, and they all look like that. You are this role, I want you to do these things. You can also get it to act as like a Python terminal, or a Splunk terminal, or an SQL terminal, or however you would like it to be. And then it'll give you some feedback based on the information that you type in there. Few shot prompting. So this one's really fun. I hate writing executive summaries for reports. But fortunately, I have a list of executive summaries I've written in the past in different scenarios, right? So say I have a bunch of high findings, here's one form of executive summary, and here's like 3 sanitized versions. Or I only have one high finding, and the rest are like information. It's not really interesting report, and so I'll have examples of that. Or maybe I only have low findings, right? But I have a ton of them. I have like 12 low findings, no highs, no mediums. And then here's a few sanitized examples of executive reports. So I can throw in 3 examples of executive reports, and then at the end say, hey, I want you to write a new executive summary, copying this style. Here's a high level of what I found. Again, don't put client vulnerability information in there, don't put internal vulnerability information in there, but keep things high level. Say, hey, I found cross-site scripting vulnerability in this, like in the XYZ API, and it allowed me to perform account takeover by changing a user's email address and then resetting their password with the forgot password feature. And so then it'll just go ahead and spit out the executive summary that I was looking for. From there, again, do not copy and paste directly into a report. Rewrite it, but use it as inspiration, so that it helps remove a lot of the cognitive lift. So I'm going to go ahead and have this write this stuff out in your chat, and then we'll go over what it's actually saying. So for this, you're a cybersecurity analyst in charge of writing recommendations for an executive audience. I'm going to provide a few examples of findings and recommendations in the past, and I'd like you to answer with your best recommendation in the same style. Keep the recommendation high level. Finding: a vulnerability in the firewall that can allow an attacker to gain access to the network. Recommendation: undertake a security review of all its firewall settings and misconfiguration issues. Second example: a vulnerability in a web server that can allow an attacker to gain access to sensitive data. Recommendation: perform automated vulnerability scans of its internet-facing servers. Finding: a vulnerability in the authentication system that can allow an attacker to gain access to user accounts. Recommendation: request an urgent security patch from the vendor that provides you with single sign-on authentication. And then I end with finding: a vulnerability in an email server that could allow an attacker to spoof emails. And then I'm given a high-level recommendation. Let's see, there we go. And so in this case, it's going to say implement email authentication protocols such as SPF, DKIM, and ZMARC to mitigate email spoofing attacks. So I'll do this to write and inspire a lot of my executive summaries. Again, I don't copy directly from here, but it helps remove a lot of the cognitive overhead, especially when you're already done with all the field work and you need to write a report. It's just a nice and easy way to make sure that your message is aligning with the standard that you've set for yourself. Oftentimes, ChatGPT will start writing its own stuff, and you can limit it by adding more constraints. You can say, do not let this exceed 3 sentences, or 2 sentences, or 150 characters, however you see fit. That's few-shot prompting. One of my favorites is zero-shot chain of thought prompting. I use this all the time. Now, think back to the Chinese room experiment, the thought experiment. It doesn't actually know what's going on, but there's no internal reasoning. So to give you an idea, there is no internal reasoning in the GPT models. It's all text. So if I give it a math equation, right? So I'm going to have it multiply all these numbers together. The correct answer is 60800 or 604,800. Let's see if it gets it right. I've typed this in enough. They probably learned from my typing. If not, let's just go ahead and create a new math equation. So in this case, it's going to put a bunch of stuff together. Oh, it's getting clever now. All right. It knows. So let's do a bunch of let's just shout out some numbers. Let's type some numbers.
8.
8,
2.
2,
14.
14. Good.
12.
12.
736.
736.
Yeah.
Let's get one more.
9999.
42.
9999. And let's throw in 42 just for good measure. I don't know what this is. Let's see if it can figure it out. It's already figuring it out. All right. Let's see if it's right.
They fixed it.
They might have.
Put a plus sign in the middle of there instead of the multiplication.
Yeah,
No,
actually,
so the way that it's doing it is actually pretty interesting, and it gets into what I was talking about. So because it doesn't do any internal reasoning, hey, stop.
try changing some of those signs and see if it gets it right, if it breaks it down in the right order.
Yeah. I'm gonna set the microphone down for a second, and I'm gonna try and type this up. Because it's not copying and pasting very
Do
well.
the other stuff, the other mic's still on, you should be good, just set it down on the other table.
Oh, yeah. So what it's supposed to do is get the answer wrong, and then we can tell it to say, hey, think step by step, and then it breaks down the independent steps, just like it did. So it's already starting to learn and bake in what's called zero-shot chain of thought learning. So it's just thinking step by step, that's all.
You do that, or they integrated Wolfram Alpha.
Yeah, they definitely integrated Wolfram Alpha in certain areas.
Yeah, the example I had a buddy who made a thing that you could type in any kind of mathematical equation or question, and it was there was a preceded prompt that said, explain why you would care about this. And it worked really well on really hard stuff like graph theory and ring theory and all this. But someone put in just 2 numbers, 2 really big numbers, like 50 trillion times like 41 billion. And the example it gave was like, what if you're selling a thing that's 50 trillion each and there's 41 billion of them? And it's like, that's 619 sextillion, that's way above the world's economy. So that's a terrible example. So it's still looking at those patterns like you're saying, Gavin, where it's just like, oh, A plus B, that's a simple equation. That's just selling stuff.
Yeah, I don't think the microphone picked that up, but that's super helpful, just kind of talking about, sorry, I lost the message, I was typing stuff. What was the TLDR of your message? I'm sorry.
The TLDR is, it works really well on complex stuff, and it fails really surprisingly. Like the simple stuff will trip it up because it's pattern-based. And so you never know when you can trust it, which is what you've been saying the whole time.
Closer.
Yeah, it's getting closer, but it's still messing up somewhere. I'm not quite sure why. Let's try 8 times. I'm just curious. 8 times 2.
But it is interesting. We finally made a computer that can't do math.
14. Yeah, right.
Progress?
12. Right, so far it's getting right. 7, 3, 6.
And I'll fill time while you're typing that. But I think the future is going to be ensemble models, just like the human brain, where eventually we'll have stuff that can figure out what it needs to kind of hand off to and use different algorithms to go ahead and say, oh, this is math, hand off to that model. Oh, this is the
There it
second
is.
thing.
No, the previous one,
Oh, the previous one was wrong?
yeah, the previous one was wrong, 701 instead of 782.
Common one that I use, where I tell it to think step by step. Sometimes what I'll say is write me some code, but before you write the code, explain what you're trying to do, and then it'll go ahead and do that. If you look at models that are using what's called LangChain, or models that are like AutoGPT, where they're actually going out to the internet and they're making certain queries, like they go ahead and tell you what it is they're trying to do, and then they do that thing. And the reason why they tell you what they're trying to do is because they have to. They're text models. They can't do any internal reasoning or any internal memorization. So now we get into the meat of things. I'm only 30 minutes in. So ChatGPT for security teams. So who does a lot of like red team offensive stuff? Okay, cool. How about development? Do anybody develop code? All right, so we got a couple people that develop code. A lot of you probably do like policy development, GRC, risk and compliance, things like that. And then what about like Splunk, blue team kind of stuff? Okay, cool. So we have a nice like range of things. So one of the easiest ones that I really like is working as a pair programmer. So if I'm trying to develop something and I'm not very familiar with how to do it, I can read the docs, or I can just have ChatGPT like kickstart things. While I'm copying this in, one thing that I do want to say is when GitHub Copilot first came out, people were saying like, oh, this is going to be the end of junior developers.
Yeah.
It turns out the people that benefit the most from tools like Copilot and from tools like this are seniors. People who are already used to seeing code and editing code and being able to identify bugs. So when you have somebody that can look at the code and see like, oh, there's a bug here, they can just go ahead and change it real quick. We'll probably see that in an example coming up soon. But this is a great opportunity, right? So this is a full Python port scanner. It's using the threading library. I gave this to a presentation at my previous job, and somebody on the call just hopped on and they're like, excuse me, we don't use threads anymore. We use the async IO library. I was like, I don't know what the hell that is. Let me try, like, all right, let's try rewrite this with the async IO library.
Does Python have IO ring?
And so here it goes, it automatically rewrites this with the async IO library. I'm short on time, otherwise I would run this and just make sure that it works, but you get the idea, right? You have the opportunity to have a nice little pair programmer working with you. It tells you exactly how to use it, right? So you get a little basic documentation, and now I can just throw this up on GitHub or my internal GitHub and go from there. I can also ask it for bash scripts. I know a lot of people, especially we're at a community college, right? Gateway Community College. So there's a lot of students who are trying to learn cybersecurity and get their OSCP or various certifications like that. So we can ask like, hey, write a bash script that can run an Nmap scan, and then based on the results of those Nmap scans, do a version scan only on the specific ports. So that's greatly going to automate your ability to perform your assessment, right? The OSCP, it's pretty famous. It's a 24-hour long test, and so where people would normally take days to crack one box, you have 1 day to crack 5 boxes. So automation is the key, and this is a quick way that you can find ways to automate your task. And then this is the output that you would normally get, right? So it runs Nmap, it saves it to the outputs, it uses grep in order to pull those outputs out, and then it uses the outputs that it pulled out as input to the final Nmap command. Some other ideas where you can start using this, again, do not outsource your thinking. You can use this for Terraform and CloudFormation, you can use this for Ansible, you can use this for Vagrant and other configuration files. So, especially as we're automating things, keep that in mind. I heard him. Yeah, I asked to say, raise your hand, say question, I'll get to a pause point, and then I'll call on you. Yeah.
Oh,
Here's a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is great for attack, but have you, and I don't want to sidetrack your,
No, go for it, go for it.
your thread, but have you used or know where defensive teams, blue teams, have said, utilizing tool X, Y, and Z, analyze my audit logs from A, B, and C to see if I have an attacker in-house.
I have 2 examples for you. Yeah, so just to repeat the question so that everybody can hear, the question was, this is great for attackers, but what about for blue teams? What can I use this for blue teams? So I have two examples. So one is going to be write a Splunk query that can look for, and I just did a simple example, right? I don't have access to Splunk, I'm not rich. So write a Splunk query to find all calls to openai.org and any domains that belong to OpenAI. So I'll show you what this looks like. I was messaging a blue team friend earlier today, actually, for some good common scenarios, and he said this is probably one of the most common scenarios. Like, hey, let me look through all of my logs. I'm not very familiar with Splunk, so I'm going to ask you, are you familiar with Splunk? No? Is anybody here familiar with Splunk?
It's been a long time.
All right, cool. What's your name?
Christian.
Christian, awesome, Christian. Does this look accurate, right? So you use index, then you just enter in an index, you type your host in star, and then the source type is going to be whatever your source type is, and then you're going to set your URL host as both openai.org and or OpenAI, star.openai.org.
Yeah, the syntax looks perfect. I mean, it could vary. The field names could vary depending on the source type. So, but that'll run.
Yeah, so just to get it on the recording, Christian said that field types can vary, and so that kind of makes sense why it's doing enter in your information, because it's just however people configure their stuff. Another good question, I have a threat hunter friend, and this is a scenario that she's been using ChatGPT on, but looking for IOCs and TTPs of attackers in your environment or types of malware and worms and things like that. So you are a senior security analyst with a specialty in incident handling and threat hunting. I'm your junior that you are mentoring by showing me the technical details of specific scenarios. What are the TTPs of Medusa malware, and what should I look for to identify it in our environment? Give me detailed information and code or log examples of indicators of compromise. Is this a little bit more into what you were looking for?
Yeah, basically I wanted to amplify your position that you could use this as a force multiplier rather than solve the problem. It's not going to solve the problem for you. It will help you paw through the data to come up with what might be going on.
Yeah, so to get that on the recording, he was saying that he was trying to amplify the position that this can be a force multiplier. It lets you paw through the data instead of you having to know everything all at once. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Awesome. Yes? Oh, 5 minutes? Oh, shit. All right. Do you guys want me to finish in 5 minutes? I have a lot of examples. One more example that I think is worth pointing out, right? I have others, right? Understanding code. Here's a copy of code snippets, and try and find the bug here. This is good for bug bounty hunting, especially if you're looking at open source code. I wouldn't copy large chunks of internal code unless they're more or less boilerplate, somewhat anonymized. Information synthesis, we saw an example of that earlier. Two that I really like, you can use this on both red teams and blue teams, but writing a nuclei template to look for certain things. So subdomain takeover is a common scenario that I've been seeing. There's a lot of bug bounty reports that come through with subdomain takeover. You can also look for IDOR and other things. Nuclei has a module that will actually allow you to authenticate to systems. So you can ask it to add authentication into that. But this is the one that I really want to show you, right? So as a security consultant, I look through a lot of code, and I look through a lot of frameworks, and I look through a lot of languages. I'm not an expert in any of these. I'm not an expert in all of these. But if I want to go and read the documentation, I can, but that's going to be 1 week I'm going to read the documentation on Java Springs, the next week I'm reading documentation on Ruby on Rails, the next week I'm reading Go, the week after that it's Node.js, the week after that it's Django, the week after that it's Python, but it's not just Python, it's Python Tornado, and then of course they throw TypeScript and CoffeeScript and all this other stuff in there. So I have an example. This is an open source application, so I can actually show you the code, but here's my example. I have a Java Springs code. Write a simple regex so that I can find all the API endpoints, and I want it to be able to paste it into VS Code. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to pop it into VS Code. So this is my application source code. I can press Control-Shift-F. This is going to find it all. I have this little dot star added in already. Oops, that's not it. I should prompt GPT first. That's a good place to start. All right. So it's going to go ahead and spit out a regular expression that's going to let me do some of this stuff. If it wants to...
It wants the code.
There we go. right, so it already made the mistake that I wanted it to make. So a lot of times it'll pick up the context that it thinks I'm writing JavaScript regex. VS Code is a little different than JavaScript regex, so we're going to see, I'm going to copy this code, I'm going to throw it into here, and it's going to fail. And the reason it's going to fail is because it does these escapes differently in Java, so you don't need to escape a quote in VS Code, so everywhere that it has a quote. And then of course this double quote we don't need. And here we go. So here's all my API endpoints. Now the trick is, if anybody knows Java Springs, these are not the only ways that you can request for API endpoints. So the request mapping is super helpful, but it's not the only way. So I'm going to ask it to modify and create different ones for get, post, put, and delete. And so it's going to spit out 4 different types of mappings. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab a get. There's going to be a number of gets. We're running into the same problem. Now I can tell ChatGPT to go ahead and fix it, but I'm going to be a little lazy and just fix it manually. Again, this is a quick and easy way that you can just go ahead and use some of this stuff. So now I have a bunch of API endpoints. This isn't always going to be all of them. There's different parameters. This is where I can start looking at the documentation. But if I'm not familiar with Java Springs, I wouldn't even know that this is what I have to look for to get the API endpoints. So this is a good starting spot, and now I can start looking at the documentation and say, like, okay, what are the docs for request mapping? What are the docs for get, put, delete? And so that's going to be a good start for me. SemGrep is a fantastic tool. If you have never used SemGrep, I highly recommend it. Unfortunately, their playground is being super buggy. Otherwise, I would show you how to actually write this as a SemGrep module, and then this works especially well for internal teams where your code base is a lot of the same kind of code. So you can just run SemGrep modules, and then it'll go and look for flaws automatically. And you can leverage ChatGPT to do that. So I only have a couple minutes left. The last little bit that I need to go over is limitations and getting the most out of ChatGPT. I want to spend a little bit more time here simply because of the conversation that we had in the previous talk. But first and foremost, there are safeguards in place. OpenAI is only allowing an API to ChatGPT. It is not allowing you to download the model and run this stuff locally. And the reason is because they want to maintain a certain amount of control. It's not for any particularly malicious purposes. It's just that once you put a tool like this out into the world, it's kind of hard to put the genie back in the bottle. So in this case, if you want to look up something like, how do I make a bomb? ChatGPT is going to say, like, that can hurt people. We're not going to tell you. When you can still Google the same information and actually get step-by-step instructions. I saw a hand go up.
Yeah, are you familiar with Freedom GPT?
Am I familiar with Freedom GPT? There are so many models that have been coming out. People ask me, like, oh, what kind of plugins do you use? Or what kind of...
Specific, so like you can download it to your machine and it doesn't have to be connected, like from what I understand. I was gonna get to that. There are so many GPT models that are coming out. So we see ChatGPT, we see Anthropic, they're coming out with Claude, we see Bard coming out of Google, and then we have some free GPTs that you can actually download and work with, to download and retrain your own GPT model. So there's a lot of GPT models that are coming out. So if somebody asks, like, have you heard of this GPT model? Like, no. But yeah, there's a lot of opportunity here. But like first and foremost, if you're going to retrain or if you're going to use somebody's like homebrew GPT model, like, you can just Google that stuff too. So I don't think that the safeguards are too much of a limitation, so much as something that you should keep an eye on when you're asking it to write malware examples, or when you're asking it to essentially just write like malicious code. Because ChatGPT is going to tell you, like, no, we're not going to do that for you. There's other ways around it. There's other things that you can do. There's jailbreaking, such like that. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but it's something you should be aware of. The next thing is called hallucinations. Again, the AI community is trying to shy away from the term hallucinations. Hallucinations is a very psychological human thing. This is a machine. People say, oh, it makes up stuff, and it's like of course it does. Like, that's a feature, not a bug. All it does is fancy text prediction. So whenever you run into a problem, just remember, fancy text prediction. It doesn't know what it's doing with code. It doesn't know what it's doing with sentences.
this looks good enough. This is the statistically most likely next token that should be there. So you will see bugs in code. You will see you won't really see typos, but you will see sentences that don't always make sense, or sometimes it'll ramble, or sometimes it'll go in a loop. Reasoning, again, it doesn't do any internal reasoning. So if you run into problems, use the zero-shot chain of thought learning to get it to think out loud, quote unquote. And as always, remember, fancy text prediction. And then of course detection, this is why I say do not write reports with it, don't just copy and paste. And again, you know what to Google. But keep that in mind. They're also working on creating invisible watermarks inside of the GPT models, so OpenAI and Anthropic are working on that. It's a way to detect whether or not something was written with a GPT model or if something was written by a human hand. So all in all, just to wrap up, if you want to take a photo, this is the contacts list, and then I have some fancy links that you'll also find to be helpful. I'm going to work on getting this notebook up onto my GitHub, just so that you can download it and play around with some of the examples we didn't have time to go over. And with that, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming here and increasing your knowledge, and I hope you find all of this useful.